This is part 2 of video 819, using an NCE mini panel to control 3 trains on the same track automatically. It's the same as part 1 except for one change in the order of the commands automatically. It's the same as part 1 except for one change in the order of the commands. In part 1, when this engine that's coming in off the main line goes in front of the Z stuff detector, immediately we would send the command to speed this train up. Now in part 2, we've just changed that so that when this engine coming off the main line crosses in front of the detector, the 8-second delay command is executed to get this train back near that red note card, but no speeds or commands are sent until that train gets back to the note card. That is to say, until the delay statement ends, and then the speed commands are sent. The reason why we're doing this is by sending the commands for this train to speed up from fast creep to cruising speed. That'll be delayed 8 seconds later if we wait till the end of the delay statement, which means effectively our main line is just a little bit longer, even though it's physically the same. It should take this train about 8 seconds before it comes into the yard area, so we'll get a little more running time. This also has the secondary effect. The commands are a little bit simpler. This demonstration of this part 2, and it's going to look almost the same as part 1, except if you just look, you'll see when this train crosses a detector in this video, nothing will happen. In part 1, when this train crossed in front of the detector, this train would immediately speed up. The demonstration lasts about, I think it's 5 or 6 or 7 minutes, but we'll go over the commands real briefly for this version, and it has made the commands a little bit simpler. The engine that's up on the trussel, the dark blue engine, we'll call that the Blue Dipper. That's a C424. The engine closest to the camera is a U23B. The engine back in the rear by the station that's out of sight is an RS2. This is almost the same operation as shown in part 1 of this video. The only difference is we made a very minor change in the order of the commands, such that when the engines pass in front of the Z stuff detector, rather than sending the speed commands right at that point, the mini panel waits until the delay statement finishes, which is when the trains get back in the rear, and then it sends the speed commands. We have basically, as before, 3 speeds of engines operating. The train coming down the trussel is at what we call cruising speed on the main line. The RS2 on the inside track is going at fast creep, and the Blue Dipper back underneath the trussel is going at what we call slow creep speed. Now, when that delay statement times out, when the engine gets back near that red note card, that engine is slowed down to what we call slow creep speed. The Blue Dipper, which is the front 2 of the creeping engines, is speeded up to fast creep, and the train on the trussel is now the mainline train. That's speeded up to cruise speed. So what we try to do is have 2 trains in the yard area creeping and 1 train on the main line at cruise speed. And then when that engine on the main line crosses in front of the detector, you can see it just went to red. We'll execute a 7-second time delay for these set of engines to get them back near the red note card. And when that delay statement ends, then the mini panel speeds up the front train to cruising speed. That's the Blue Dipper coming down the trussel. And the one going up the trussel, that's going at fast creep speed. The one in the rear is at slow creep speed. And the key thing is when the engines get back in the rear where the red note card is, they need to pull that caboose up past the note card before the next engine arrives, or the next engine might bump the caboose. We got to keep the trains separated. And as I mentioned in part 1, this layout kind of is pushed to the max for this type of operation. The length of trains on the system in regard to the amount of track is available, it's pretty tricky to keep them separated. I'd call this system almost unstable over a long period of time. As we demonstrated in part 1, if you use slower, shorter trains, you automatically get more separation because the trains aren't so long. And conversely, if we had a longer main line, we'd get a more stable separation because the trains would have more time to creep in the yard. And as before, that our detector, which is over on the right, that just went from red to green, or green to red, that's a Z-Stuff DZ1011 block signal detector. In other words, it has the block signal lights, but it also has an infrared detection system, and that's controlling a Z-Stuff DZ1008 relay, which is what's sending the signal to the mini panel that the trains have crossed in front of the detector. But the idea of making this change in the commands by making all the speed changes happen after the delay statement instead of when the train crossed in front of the detector, the idea of that change was to effectively try to get a longer effective main line, even though the main line is physically the same, by having the trains creep for that extra 7 seconds. It takes them a little longer to get around. Now that change has been effectively negated, I guess you could say, or canceled out, because these 3 engines, you notice I've switched to 3 different engines just to try to make it look like a different video, but these are older engines with older decoders, and I can't control the speeds quite as well as I'd like to. I usually run these engines in numerical order. You can see 451 is the one that just passed in front of the camera. The one that's following that on the inside, the U23, that's number 2316. And then the one that's following those 2 that just went in front of the detector, the RS2, that's number 4020. You don't have to do that, obviously, but it's easier for me if I just put the trains in numerical order on the track. Now that blue dipper that came down the trestle that's about ready to go in front of the detector, if you watch that back in the rear, you can see it pulls up a little bit further. I increased the delay statement for just that one engine from 7 seconds instead of 9 seconds. You can see it brings it up about 2.5 feet in front of the note card, that is to say downstream of the note card, before it slows it down. And I was just trying to get a little more space between it and that U23B that's coming down the trestle right now, because the U23B was tending to get close to the Blue Dipper. But then again, the general scheme, when that engine gets back to the note card in the rear that came off the main line, it speeds up the front creeping engine. Meanwhile, the engine that was the rear creeping engine, which is the Blue Dipper, that now is the front creeping engine. The mini panel speeds that up just a little to keep it ahead of the following train. So the overall scheme is 2 trains creeping in the yard, one train out on the main line running at cruising speed. Here's the revised command file for part 2 of this video that shows the 3 blue Delaware and Hudson locomotives operating. It basically breaks down into 3 parts. Here's part 1, part 2, and part 3. And they're essentially the same, except the engine numbers are just changed. If we look at this little diagram, here's our sensor. And sitting downstream of the sensor when we start out are the 3 locomotives. So what these commands in the first part will do is just start these 3 locomotives up. This will be started to cruising speed, and these 2 will be started to creeping speed, slow creeping speed here and fast creeping speed here. Now if you picture this little diagram going around a loop of track and coming in and coming back in past the sensor, that's what happens when this Loco 451 goes around the loop. And our statement says here, wait till 451 crosses the detector, delay 9 seconds to get the caboose past the sensor. At that point, we're in the part 2, and now Loco 451 is on the rear. So what we do essentially is we have the mini panel increase this train speed from fast creep up to cruising speed. This train gets increased from slow creeping speed up to fast creeping speed, and this engine's speed gets changed from cruising speed to slow creeping speed. And then we do the same thing. We wait till 2316. The orange icon here goes around and comes around the loop and passes past the sensor. And at that point, we're here. Wait till 2316 crosses the detector. 7-second delay. And then we send the commands for part 3, and it's the same thing all over again, except the engines are just at a different position. So we increase this one to cruising speed. This one gets increased to fast creeping speed. This one gets reduced from cruising speed to slow creep speed. And then that just repeats. And we still have the knife switch test question in here. If input 1 is closed, it links to input 17, which is the beginning, and repeats it. If input 1 is open, then it skips over that link statement that goes down here that just shuts all the locomotives off. So this is basically does the same thing as part 1, except, as I mentioned earlier, we send a delay. We don't do anything as far as changing speeds until after the delay statement occurs. In other words, when we start everything up, the locos are running. The first one, the 451, crosses the detector. We delay 9 seconds before we send any change of speed commands. Then we reset the speed on all 3 locomotives and wait till the next one goes around, and then we reset the speed on all 3 locomotives a third time and keep repeating. Looking at the schematic again here, if you consider this my layout on the top with a relatively small loop relative to 3 6-car trains operating in the video, it's kind of tight. If I increase the speed of these to get them past the sensor, to get the caboose pulled past the sensor, then I'm eating up mainline, so to speak, and this train gets around here that much faster. Ideally, if we had a preferred longer mainline like this sketch shows, this engine that's out here on the mainline would have lots more time to cruise all the way around and come back to the sensor. So these could be set to a relatively slow speed, and they would still have enough time to pull the 6 cars past the sensor, or maybe even more cars, like 10 cars. So as I mentioned in part 1, my layout's probably pretty much at the limit with 6-car trains. And if you recall, when we reduced it to just 4-car trains, we had lots more space. We've pulled these 3 trains together so they're all taking up one continuous length of track. You can see the rear caboose is back here where this red note card is, and you can follow the 3 trains around over here where this other red note card is, and that's the amount of track that these trains occupy when they're parked end to end. And just to see how much of the layout they're taking up, I divided up the rest of the layout into equal chunks, approximately using red note cards, just doing this by eyeball. But you can see if you follow from this note card here around over to this note card, that's an empty track section approximately the length of these 3 trains. And then if we go from this note card around down to this note card, that's a second length of empty track approximately equal to the length of the trains. And then from this note card over to this note card is a third length of track. So basically there's 3 empty lengths of track and 1 occupied length of track by the 3 trains. So basically these 3 trains are taking up approximately 25% of the layout, which is probably a bit much. That the train should be shorter really to operate reliably on this layout with this type of control system. Here we are with the same system, except we've shortened each train by 2 cars. Instead of having 6-car trains, we now have 4-car trains as you see it operating now. And you can hopefully see it opens up a little bit of space on the main line, having less length of trains running. And just to review what's happening, those 2 trains on the inside are creeping. The one coming off the trestle is running at mainline cruise speed. And when it goes across that detector, you see the Z-stuff detector turned red. There's a 7-second delay, and when it gets back to about where the note card is, the mini panel will slow that train down to slow creep speed. The Blue Dipper that's on the inside kind of coming toward the camera, it speeded that one up to fast creep speed, and the RS2 that's up on the trestle, that one's now been speeded up to mainline speed. The same thing will happen in a second when that RS2 goes in front of the Z-stuff block detector. The contacts on the Z-stuff relay will close, which notifies the mini panel that it's there. When the train gets back to about where the red note card is, it was slowed down to slow creep speed. The U-23 that's just starting up the trestle, that one's at fast creep speed. The Blue Dipper that's coming around in front, that's going to go in front of the detector a minute, and the cycle will just keep repeating. Just to review, we've got an NCE mini panel, which is on this board over here. That's the mini panel, and that's what's actually controlling these trains. There's a Z-stuff infrared DZ1011 detector. That's the device you see going red and green, and then you can't really see it, but back there there's a, well, yes, you can see it back right about here. There's a DZ10008 relay, and that's what's that's connected to input 16 of the mini panel, and that's how the mini panel knows a train is crossed in front of that detector. If you compare this with the video, the part 1 of the video, you can see my trains when they're creeping faster than they were in part 1, and that's not really good. But the engine that's giving me problems is that U-23 that's coming in front of the water tower on the inside. That's an Atlas engine with a Digitrax decoder, and I don't know which one it is, but I can't run that much below speed step 5, or it's not consistent. Sometimes it'll crawl and sometimes it'll go faster, but it's not consistent below speed step 5. So I got to run that at speed step 5, which is what you see right now, and then adjust the other 2 trains accordingly. The 3 locomotives that you saw in part 1, the Shark Nose and the Erie Lackawanna Trainmaster and the Santa Fe GP35, those 3 locomotives from part 1, I could run those slower in the yard area, and like I said, I'd prefer to do that here, but I'm unable to do so. It makes these 3 trains a little bit harder to control, even though the logic in the mini panel is better, I believe, than in part 1. In part 1 right now is when the RS2 would speed up if this was part 1, but remember in part 2 we changed it so it waits till the end of the delay statement, and then the RS2 speeds up when the train that crossed in front of the detector gets back by the note card. That's when the trains in the yard get speeded up. That's the difference between part 1 and part 2. You can probably see for regular running, 4-car trains are probably a little easier to handle on this small size of a layout, given my main line that's not too much bigger than the 3 trains put together when we've got 6-car trains running. To stop this system, I need to open that knife switch before the RS2 gets around by the red note card. After the delay statement ends, it's taking that RS2 from the block detector back to the red note card. There's a statement in the mini panel's programming that says, is the knife switch closed, or more accurately, is it input 1 grounded? And if it's not grounded, then it stops all 3 trains, which is what you see happening here now. Here we're just running the 3 engines by themselves. This is about as short as a train can get. And again, as we saw in part 1 with the other 3 engines, with just the 3 engines, of course, there's lots of space between the trains. Now that delay statement ended, you can see the blue dipper back in the far rear slowed down to slow creep, and the U-23 that was up on the trestle, that's been speeded up to mainline cruise speed. Now when that U-23 crosses in front of the detector, the mini panel will execute a 7-second time delay, which will get it back about to the red note card's position. Then it'll speed up the RS2 on the trestle, and it'll slow down the U-23 back in the rear to slow creep speed. Meanwhile, the blue dipper that's right in front of the camera, heading for up the trestle, that's running at fast creep speed. Now when the RS2 goes in front of the detector, you see it go to red. Again, we'll get a 7-second time delay. When it gets back to the note card, about the 7-second delay will end. It'll be slowed down to slow creep speed. The blue dipper that's coming down the trestle, that was speeded up to mainline speed, and the U-23 that's headed up the trestle, that's running at fast creep speed. Actually, I'm using speed step 5 for both slow creep for that engine and fast creep for that engine, because on speed 6 it runs too fast, so it's not ideal, but it's the best I can do the way the engine's set. You can see, hopefully, with 3 short trains consisting of nothing but the locomotive, they tend to have lots of space between them. Now the RS2 going up the trestle just got speeded up to cruising speed. The U-23 that's back in the rear is running at slow creep speed. and the blue dipper that's starting up the trestle's running at fast creep speed. I just opened the knife switch, and the RS2 coming down the trestle, when that gets back to the rear by the note card, it'll be at the last line of the program where it checks to see if input 1 is closed, and it's no longer closed since I opened the knife switch, so it'll send a set speed 0 command to all 3 of the locos and everything will stop.